Hello and welcome to Early Childhood Ireland's podcast, which features interviews and discussions on all issues relating to high quality in the early years and school-age care sectors. In our episodes, we've a range of speakers who are leaders in the areas that matter to Early Childhood Ireland members. This podcast series is proudly supported by Aricus Insurance, which offers a comprehensive range of cover at discounted premiums for both business and personal insurance products. So visit www.aricus.ie for more information. I'm Maura Corbett and I work with Early Childhood Ireland. So you know by now that this current series of the podcast relates to supporting and valuing multilingualism. It's linked to our work on the OWL, Our World of Language project, funded by the Late Late Toy Show Appeal. And if you've heard the earlier episodes, you'll know that Dr. Christina Egan-Marnell spoke about how we can demonstrate and recognise the many languages young children and families may speak or encounter every day. And this one was followed by Suzanne McCarthy talking about how we support identity and belonging by demonstrating to older children and their families how we value the languages they speak at home or in their communities. So to wrap up this series and indeed this year of Early Childhood Ireland's podcast, I'm delighted to be joined by Liz Kerrins and Dr. Francesca Morgia. Liz is Director of Research with Early Childhood Ireland, where she's worked since 2019. She previously led on the Children's Rights Alliance Early Childhood Education and Care programme of work. She's an experienced social researcher, policy analyst and children's advocate. She's worked with the Children's Research Centre, Trinity College, the Society of St. Vincent de Paul, DIT and Threshold. She has published research reports, book chapters and journal articles on early childhood policy and services. Francesca is the director of Mother Tongues, which is a social enterprise working to promote multilingualism and intercultural dialogue in Ireland through a creative arts-based approach. Francesca has an MPhil in Applied Linguistics from Trinity College Dublin and a PhD in Bilingual Language Acquisition from DCU. She lectured in language development from 2010 to 2021 across various universities, holding posts at the University of Reading, Trinity College, Ulster University and Maynooth University. Francesca's work with Mother Tongues focuses on learning, research and policy development across education and the arts. Francesca and Liz, you're both really welcome. Thanks for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you, Maura.
So we've made reference a few times in this series and even throughout other series about the OWL project. And I know that many of you listening will know something about it already. But it kind of strikes me there's probably no harm in asking you to tell us a bit more about the project. Liz, do you want to take that one?
I will indeed. Thanks, Maura. So, as you already said, in 2022, Early Childhood Ireland and Mother Tongues partnered to design, develop and implement the Our World of Languages project. So it was a small-scale arts-based storytelling pilot project funded through the Toy Show Appeal in 2022. So we really wanted to, I suppose, we see a lot of approaches from other countries to enabling linguistic diverse pedagogy. And I suppose we wanted to really develop and trial and test an approach of our own. And we had developed a partnership with Mother Tongues. So that's what we did. We developed our pilot, and the pilot really was about supporting families to experience a sense of identity and belonging in early years settings, because research suggests that experiencing a positive sense of identity and belonging is critical for families and children's effective engagement in early learning. And we piloted the workshop-based OWL approach in 2 preschools in a culturally and linguistically diverse area of Dublin. So we learned a lot from the implementation of the OWL project and from an independent evaluation of the OWL pilot by Maynooth University. And we use this learning to develop the OWL provocation pack aimed at early years educators to support them to strengthen linguistically responsive pedagogy in their preschool settings using a play and arts-based storytelling approach. And you'll find this provocation pack is available open access and free on the earlychildhoodireland.ie website. So you'll find that there. We launched it in September, and then we held a really well-attended webinar in October 2023 for early years educators and providers. So as I say, we learned a lot. We used the learning to develop the pack, the provocation pack. But we also, I suppose, the project really, for us in Early Childhood Ireland at least, and I'm sure also for mother tongues, also allowed us the space to pause and to reflect ourselves. When we talk a lot about the importance of reflection for good pedagogy and good practice. And let me tell you, it's exactly the same for research and researchers. And we were lucky enough, myself and Francesca, to be working with our colleagues in both of our organisations who are early childhood researchers and who were also communications professionals, education professionals, and children's advocates. And I suppose one of the things that we reflected on was about the language that we use about language. It's the language that we use to frame this issue. And this is really, I suppose, where our to and fro and our reflection on, should we be using the word multilingualism, which is kind of one of the more common words I think we see in Ireland? Should we use plurilingualism? And you start thinking, well, what's in a word? How much does a word really matter? And obviously we know, but we do know from research, we know from our own lives that the words that we use, the language that we around any issue really frames the issue, and sometimes without meaning to, maybe sometimes we do mean to, but certainly for us without meaning to, sometimes we can emphasize dominant values and dominant ways of thinking, dominant cultures, dominant languages, and in the Irish case it's the English language, that may not be truly inclusive, and they can affect the words that we use affect how we think, and how we think affects how we act. And not only that, we can be influencing others to act in certain ways if we're not careful, I suppose, about the language that we use. So really that reflection led us from multilingualism to plurilingualism.
Okay, that I was going to ask you that because, in conversations around Early Childhood Ireland and the webinar and so on, I kind of noticed that change in terminology, and I was interested to hear more about the concept. And you've said a little bit about that idea of unconsciously emphasizing or dwelling on kind of dominance rather than true inclusion. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that change from multilingualism, which is, like you say, the more dominant, more common term?
Yeah.
Pardon the pun.
That's okay. Words have lots of meanings as well. So I suppose we were moving from plurilingualism, moving to plurilingualism. It's a different view, I suppose, of linguistic diversity, and that view also reflects a different way of thinking about linguistic diversity. And the word plurilingualism really better reflects, I think, Early Childhood Ireland's values, which are very much inclusive of diversity and equality and inclusion. Just to say, we have, I suppose, been influenced by the Council of Europe in this regard as well. So the Council of Europe encourages us to use the term plurilingualism rather than multilingualism, and to emphasize that this word plurilingualism is much more inclusive and much more forward-looking, and it is more than just changing a word. So I suppose multilingualism describes a situation where different languages coexist side by side in our society, or in any society, in our society here in Ireland, without necessarily mixing. So, implying that people and their languages really exist in silos, in social silos, in linguistic silos. But we know that's not the case. We all live in the world, and we know that's not the case. And we know it as researchers from research. We know it as early childhood educators. We know it as children's advocates. That's not how our early years settings in our communities work. So I suppose our own values and principles will tell us that they also tell us that we want to live together and go beyond, I suppose, tolerating each other's language or tolerating each other's culture. Who wants to be tolerated? If someone said, well, do you like Liz? Well, I can tolerate her. Doesn't really kind of ring very, very inclusively in your own mind. And we also want, I suppose, to be living together in a way that's about being more than the sum of our parts. So we're not all just these separate people, and you add us all together, and that's what you get. So we want to be more than the sum of our parts, and to be actively transforming our communities and our earlier settings together, using all the linguistic and cultural resources that we have available to us. And we know as well that from research in settings that all children's learning and development is enriched by the language repertoires in which they are enmeshed. So it's of value to all of us, and it's a benefit to all of us, to be engaging with each other in a plurilingual way and in an intercultural way.
Francesca, it strikes me as a very kind of mutually respectful way of being together. Francesca, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think in terms of terminology, I agree with Liz that when we want to convey a message, the language we use is extremely important, especially when we're working with young children. And also when our work has such a significant impact on not only on the lives of children, but also the extended community. That is not just the children, the educators, but it's also the parents, the families, and everybody in the community. And sometimes terminology, I find, even myself as a researcher, we have to update our knowledge all the time. Even in the subject that you're an expert in, there'll be new strands of thought, new theories coming along. So it's something, the evolution of terminology also means our evolution of what we find and what we evolve with the evolution of knowledge and with our enhanced understanding of an issue. Maybe wanting to be too strictly attached to a certain terminology is not such a positive thing to do, because what we want is for our words to reflect our society, to reflect our needs, to reflect the theories that are changing. And in relation to bilingualism, even for a long, long time, there was this concept of a child who's bilingual, who is maybe believed or was believed to be a child who knows two languages so well that it's almost like a machine translator from language A to language B. But now everybody has such a more advanced understanding of bilingualism that they know that children might have one language that is stronger than the other, or one language that they prefer speaking to the other, or one language maybe where they have more passive knowledge. So bilingualism, even in itself, is more complex. So we realize it, as a word itself, it doesn't fit every single child that we encounter on a daily basis. That's why we have words such as trilingual, which is a child who speaks three or can function in three languages. Plurilingual, which is three or more. We also have words that for a long time were quite difficult to enter our day-to-day dictionary, like heritage languages, for example. So we say if you have a child whose family whose parents speak Italian, say, and they're raised in an English-speaking country, then Italian is considered the child's heritage language. So that is also a word that has no specific, I suppose it's not a label of dominance of one language versus another language in society. It's just heritage language shows how the child has acquired the language. But sometimes we tend to use home language, which maybe many of us are using even in our day-to-day conversation. What's your home language? So there are obviously different purposes for different parts of our terminology or technical terminology, but it is, the words we choose to use very often reflects our intention and our mindset. And so that's why I agree with Liz in that we have to be very careful about it. And even in our early year settings, in our primary schools, sometimes we might end up calling a child by the nationality of the parents, saying something like, okay, I have the Polish child here. And that label itself is not a negative label, or it's not something that we should avoid, but it has a very specific meaning because it's a national identity. And maybe I'm not sure if the child identifies fully as someone from that national identity, but we are, by using a label that is a national label. We are sometimes stressing the dichotomy or the two polar opposites. You can be Irish or you can be Polish. And so many children will tell you, and I'm using Polish because so many of my neighbors speak Polish. But the children will tell you, well, I'm a bit of this and a bit of that. And, if you ask them to talk about their identity, there's a lot more than just Irish or Polish. And they travel across their identities as they evolve, as they grow up. So there's many words, the nationality, other labels or other phrases that we might use, even when we refer to language, that might be tricky. We might say, first of all, we might assume that a child can speak the language of the parents when we cannot be quite sure if children speak the language, if parents speak the language. But also when it comes to knowledge of English, sometimes we also need to be careful when addressing parents, when addressing children, about saying things like child X doesn't speak any English. And often that child understands what we're saying, so they have more than no English. But again, not focusing on the deficit, but maybe referring to a child as a bilingual child or as an emergent bilingual, who is someone who is becoming bilingual. So, or second language learner. So there's a lot to be said about using more neutral terminology, but also terminology that describes the evolution of the child's linguistic competence, the cultural competence, the child's identity in a multicultural and multilingual space that is not just black and white, you're either this or that.
Is there a wider context? I mean, we've talked about the terminology that we need to think about, the evolution from the idea of multilingualism to plurilingualism, and other terminology we need to think about. Is there a kind of a wider context that's coming into play that's helping to influence and shape our thinking on that?
I think so. I suppose Francesca there is talking about, and it was something we're very concerned with now. And I know the previous two podcasts more have been very concerned with, I suppose, this, thinking about our terminology, and being open and being curious about changes in what we think and what we know about children's identities. And their emerging identities we know that it's very important for professional development. So I suppose there is a link, and there's always a link from that kind of more specific piece that is represented by the OWL project to the wider context. Yeah, so I mentioned the Council of Europe earlier on. So, obviously we've all got this European identity now, to greater or lesser extents. We're living in a European, we're part of the European Union. We're acting within that context. And, I suppose Europe is kind of leading on this reframing of language, and reframing of understandings around language. And in Ireland, there isn't really a policy on whether you think about home language, heritage language, just thinking there about what Francesca was talking about. There isn't really a specific policy on that as such. Your listeners, I'm sure, will be familiar with changes that have come about in the secondary school curriculum and now the primary school curriculum around language. And it's very often as children as either learners of English, the English language, because they're coming from somewhere else, or it's about different languages. Kind of teaching different languages in primary and secondary schools to children, but not necessarily about the resources and the repertoires that they're bringing with them into their settings. So there's something there, I think, in Ireland about how do we really enable. We tried in the OWL project, and we'll continue to work together. We have a number of other projects as well on the go between us and Mother Tongues and Early Childhood Ireland to try to enable that kind of linguistically diverse pedagogy in settings. But there's a piece around the policy, and the national structures have to also enable that kind of an approach to language. ASHTR at the moment is being, as your listeners will know, is being reviewed and revised, and there's been consultations going on that. And ASHTR is also, it's very, kind of, I suppose, world renowned as being a high quality curriculum framework for early childhood. And, you'd really like to see, I suppose, a deeper approach maybe to plurilingualism in that policy, and a kind of approach to plurilingualism that includes all of the world languages, of which there are many, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them, but also languages like, I suppose, native languages like the Irish language, like Cant or Shelta, the language of the Irish traveller community. So it's about normalising plurilingualism in settings and framing practice through this kind of, I suppose, professional development around terminology. So I think that's kind of the wider context. But ultimately, whatever happens, it's going to have to be fun, because we Early Childhood Ireland and Mother Tongues very much espouse a play-based approach to enabling linguistically responsive pedagogy in preschools and also in primary schools. So whatever happens, it really has to be fun. So that's kind of, I suppose, the way that children will be learning and will be engaging with each other.
And I suppose that kind of segues us nicely into, we've heard about that wider context, the policy, the European policy, and so on. But educators listening to this will be saying, well, what's that going to mean for me? How's that going to impact on my early years or school age care setting? Francesca, do you want to talk to us about that?
I suppose I agree with Liz in that we come across, obviously, a lot of questions in mother tongues that come our way, obviously in the projects we do with you, but also when we have requests for advice, like what's the best thing I can do to make sure that all children feel that this is their home when they come in and they see their friends, and they, how can it be welcoming all languages? Even though sometimes we obviously don't know all languages because there's not an expectation to be had. And I suppose because we've been talking about the language used, I think what's really important is to take into consideration that the way we use language, even in the interactions with the children, the way we encourage maybe a child to speak their own language is really crucial. So in the provocation pack where we have suggestions, we have ideas, they're all fun, they're all creative and craft-based and arts-based. And we've always said, you can make all of this your own because you're the most creative people, but also you're the people that children really trust every day. And they want to be with you, they want to learn from you. So having interest or showing interest in the child's language, in the child's way of saying a word, but pure interest rather than being inquisitive and looking for, say, an error or this is how we say it in this language or that language, but really letting children express themselves through play, through any sort of role play or interaction, using all languages and treating all languages equally. So showing the children that every language really matters, then this will have an immediate positive impact on the children. Ultimately, it will have a positive impact on everyone in society, because obviously we're preaching to a group of people who really care and who really listen to this because they want to do something different, or maybe they want to adapt what they do to be more inclusive of different languages. But even simple things, like I said earlier, about labeling. As an educator, you might think about it already quite a lot of the time in relation to many other, not only language, but about play and about other things. But language is a habit. We can look at lots of different theories, but we have been used to be changing the way we speak because generations changed the language. Even throughout the life of an individual, we change the way we speak. So I would like to kind of maybe leave a message that using terminology that is more inclusive of different languages, that is encouraging the diversity of languages to be freely utilized, is something that takes only a little bit of practice and suddenly becomes second nature. So what I would like to leave as a message is that this is not an extra additional kind of difficulty to be added to your very heavy workload already, but it's something that can easily become common practice. So asking questions, not calling children by the language they speak or the nationality of the parents, but maybe encouraging children to be more inquisitive and asking questions and maybe sharing parts of their identity that they wouldn't share otherwise. And for us, I suppose, we're a small not part of the society, but it's quite difficult to change the world. But I think this is a very strong beginning because we're working with the young people in our society who will then pick up from yourselves the terminology that is inclusive, the language that is open to everyone, and then they will use it themselves and they will change then the Ireland that we're trying to build together.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's so important as we've seen. Liz, do you want to add to that in terms of the impact that this will have for settings?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, it's about, I suppose, that expression, be the change you want to see in the world, that we keep seeing that on the bottom of people's emails. And I think that Gandhi, a term from Gandhi. I suppose, I think that's pretty much, what Francesca is kind of laying out for us there, it's about the setting becoming a kind of an inclusive, open, democratic space, where all children, can be themselves and can really display their identity, and be proud of their identity, but their identity within their own group, whatever that group is, that community, that family, and to be able to bring that with them to the setting, and to be able to develop their own a positive sense of identity, really, I suppose. And, early childhood settings are the place for that. And early childhood, it really is the time for that. And children are very, very good advocates themselves. They really can go out there and be the advocates for change as well themselves.
When they see that value and appreciation, exactly, being modelled for them.
Yeah,
absolutely. Exactly. Because it's not even what they hear, it's what they see. So thank you both so much. That's been a lovely way to wrap up the series, and that quote about be the change you want to see is a message that we can very easily and fittingly bring forward into 2024. So thank you both so much for joining me. It's been a pleasure talking to you both, and I really enjoyed the chat.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maura.
And thank you for listening to this episode of Early Childhood Ireland's podcast, which is proudly supported by Aricus Insurance. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and spread the word to your friends and colleagues, and stay tuned for our next episode.